Entergy is proud to support programming on LPB and greener practices that preserve Louisiana.
The goal of our environmental and sustainability initiatives really is to ensure that our kids and future generations can be left with a cleaner planet.
Additional support provided by the Fred B. and Ruth B. Ziegler Foundation and the Ziegler Art Museum located in Jennings City Hall. The museum focuses on emerging Louisiana artists and is an historical and cultural center for Southwest Louisiana. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting, with support from viewers like you.
There's still going to be a long way to go.
A tough financial future under a best-case scenario.
The Gulf of Mexico is rising in South Louisiana.
A new task force gives an agenda for change.
When I read it in the paper last Saturday, I really thought we had time.
A plant shutdown leaves St. James Parish scrambling. Hi, everyone. I'm André Moreau. Much more on those top stories in a moment on this week's edition of SWI. But first, the coronavirus. Numbers continue to climb in Louisiana and nationwide, and they are climbing in a week in which we got good news about a vaccine from Pfizer that could soon be ready for federal approval. And with Thanksgiving and then Christmas, those holidays coming, infectious disease doctors are now suggesting to many to strongly consider having virtual family gatherings. The governor warned about a troubling spike with the numbers higher than they've been. Almost 3,500 new and probable cases today, more than 200,000 overall since this all began. He spoke with the media this afternoon.
There are 692 patients in the hospital with COVID-19 across the state of Louisiana. That's up 16 from yesterday. It is also the highest number since September the 11th. So we have quite literally lost a couple of months' worth of improvements in terms of hospitalizations are concerned. 62 of those individuals are on mechanical ventilators, and that's up by 3 since yesterday. Statewide positivity continues to inch up. On November 1st, it was 4.6%. On November the 8th, 5.2%. And again, we know that it's increasing across the state and in just about every region. And this doesn't just happen. It happens for a reason. 2 weeks ago tomorrow, I guess it was, Halloween, and I received an awful lot of reports that in communities all across Louisiana, it was obvious, I should say, that individuals were not adhering to the mitigation measures to the degree that they had before.
Meantime, a court this week denied Attorney General Jeff Landry's attempt to take away the governor's emergency orders around COVID, so those orders stand in place. Also this week, big news for New Orleans as bars indoors began serving again in what is known as Phase 3.3. Now a check on some other headlines making news across Louisiana. A COVID outbreak on LSU's team stemming from a Halloween party has forced the postponement of Saturday night's game in Tiger Stadium with number 1 Alabama. It's unknown if the game can be made up. It's one of 4 major SEC games not being played this weekend. An investigation is underway after LSU player Coy Moore says Baton Rouge police violated him at gunpoint last weekend. The incident allegedly occurred at a rooftop party. Moore tweeted about it. The officers have been placed on administrative leave. It's official. The 2020 hurricane season will go down as the most active ever on record, with several weeks left. Theta was the 29th named storm. The previous record was 28 storms in 2005. One of the 3 hurricanes to hit Louisiana this year, Zeta, hit the state's citrus growers hard just at harvest time. Groves in Plaquemines Parish had the worst of it, with growers saying they lost 50 to 75% of their crop. FEMA has approved help for 5 more parishes from Hurricane Delta. They include Beauregard, Lafayette, Rapides, St. Landry, and St. Martin. A total of 10 parishes can get help. Homeowners and renters can apply for federal disaster aid. Grand Fuels is considering a major new facility at the Port of Baton Rouge. All told, the complex could involve up to $9.2 billion in total investment and be one of the largest renewable fuel complexes in the world. Grand officials say the plant would use soybean, canola, and used cooking oil to produce renewable diesel fuel. With jobs in the many thousands, the port says it would be one of the biggest economic deals in 2 decades. Lucille Bridges, who led her daughter across a color line to attend school, died of cancer in New Orleans this week. It was in 1960 that Mrs. Bridges escorted 6-year-old Ruby to an all-white school in New Orleans. Federal marshals stood guard. Protesters chanted and threw eggs. In this photograph of Mrs. Bridges, she is seen standing next to the Norman Rockwell painting of her daughter on that day in 1960. The title of the painting is "The Problem We All Live With." Lucille Bridges was 86. Democrat Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump and will be our next president. But what would potential Biden changes mean for Louisiana in the next 4 years? I talked with 3 of the state's top leaders about the transition: Stephen Barnes, director of the Blanco Public Policy Center at UL Lafayette; Dek Terrell, director of LSU's Economic Policy Research; and Anna Osland, Workforce and Policy Initiatives at Blanco Center. As we look at a new president, just right off the bat, what do we see as changes, things that Louisiana could face that would be different than they have the past 4 years?
I think the biggest changes will be in terms of executive orders and regulatory changes. Most likely, we have a large debt, and in addition, it's just going to be hard to finance really big policy initiatives like a major infrastructure package, or an expansion of Medicare, or a mini Green New Deal. So I think what we're most likely to see is regulatory policies. And unfortunately, I think some of those might be bad economically for Louisiana, regardless of how you feel about them.
What are your thoughts on changes that the state could face that would be good or bad with a new administration?
I'm really interested to see where we're going to go with changes to post-secondary. One of the things that Biden had proposed was 2 years of free college, community college for adults. And so I think that could, in Louisiana, make a real big change to how we view the landscape of post-secondary education and how we're financing that. I also was really interested to see some of the different options that they are suggesting in terms of how we use Pell Grants. So Pell Grants are the grants that are generally used to support the very lowest income college students. And so thinking about new ways that we can expand the use of Pell Grants, I'd love to see some opportunities for year-round Pell Grants. Our businesses need to have a highly skilled and qualified workforce, and whether that's an industry-based credential, an associate's degree, a 4-year degree, a graduate degree, whatever it is, families have to know how they can finance that, and that's a huge part of being successful in college.
Well, Stephen, let me ask you this. Talking about economics, our economy has gone from solid and strong to some would say a virtual collapse, but certainly it's has tanked. So how would certain policies help that would help us dig out of that?
There's good news on the front of the vaccine that realistically there may be a path forward towards a quicker recovery in 21, or at least that we can be assured that we're on that track of recovery. But there's still going to be a long way to go to really get the economy back to where it was before this took hold. And we can keep a lookout and hope for at least some smaller incremental measures, especially some aid to state and local government, which will certainly be needed in the year ahead.
Dek, I think you maybe were alluding to this a bit about some of the transition plans that Biden has for the oil industry in Louisiana, and that sort of frightens some people right off the bat. But there are people who say that we have been transitioning already.
What I'm thinking about is just general statements during the election. Like during the debate, there was a general statement that the chemical industry on pollution, that the chemical industry interpreted as potentially adverse. And you never know what the final regulations are going to look like on oil and gas or chemicals. And it's also true that both of them are smaller as a percentage of our economy than they were in the 1980s. But on the other hand, any sort of adverse policies on those two industries could have a very adverse impact on Louisiana.
I think to the question of how the long run transition in the energy industry would impact a state like Louisiana, I think it's certainly something that's already underway, and you hear major oil and gas companies talking about that and starting to make investments here and there in renewable energies and alternative energy as they think about their long-term future. But to Dek's point, traditional fossil fuel driven activity continues to be a big driver of the state's economy. And so if we think about policies that will accelerate that transition, there is going to be some economic pain that comes with that.
How about I get a final thought from everybody? Anna, let's start with you.
So if I was to just kind of think through, what are the three areas that I'm going to be watching, I'd say that first of all, investments in early care and education. For Louisiana, starting our kids off right and starting them off early is going to be hugely important to our long-term success. Second would be, where we're going with post-secondary and funding for post-secondary. And then probably the third thing that I'm going to be following closely is rural broadband. So, we've had this huge upheaval of our society where many employers and students are, either learning remotely or working remotely, and our state could definitely use additional investments in broadband, especially in our rural areas.
Yeah, Louisiana lags greatly in that. Dek, what about you? Some final thoughts?
I agree with Anna that early childhood education would be a big plus for Louisiana if there's some investments in that. I will be watching the impact on the oil and gas industry and chemicals manufacturing, because if you look at Lauren Scott's latest study, he said there were 300,000 jobs directly or indirectly coming from oil and gas. So that's more than 1 in 7 workers that are dependent on oil and gas in Louisiana. And that's going to be a bigger impact than any state in the entire country.
Okay. And Stephen?
Well, looking ahead to the next 4 years, I think we'll want to watch closely what the outcome is of the runoffs in Georgia and see what the final makeup of Congress is. I think it's most likely that we're not going to be looking at sweeping changes through Congress and thinking about broad changes in law, but a lot of the policies that a Biden administration is going to want to push forward are going to be done through the regulatory process. And so that's something that we'll have to watch closely. There's always opportunity for comment, and we'll work at the Blanco Center to try to help keep the public informed and engaged in that process. And also helping work with state government to ensure that new opportunities that may emerge to harness federal funds through large grant programs that many state agencies depend on in a big way, that we can look for those opportunities and help bring those dollars to Louisiana to invest them in the best way possible.
I appreciate everybody's comments tonight, coming from 4 different areas, and it worked very well. Thanks so much, you guys.
The push to try and build wind farms off the Louisiana coast was just one of a ton of topics as the governor convened the state's first meeting of the new Climate Initiatives Task Force. I talked with Chip Klein, CPRA chairman and chair of the task force, and Harry Vorhoff, who's director of the Office of Coastal Initiatives.
I think a lot of people across the state were, I'll say, somewhat pleasantly surprised that the state of Louisiana is finally getting serious about an existential issue that's facing our state. But what better place than the state of Louisiana to really start focusing on this issue? When you look at all of the issues that we face across our coast, from land loss to the vulnerabilities that we continue to face from hurricanes, the fact that we've had 8 named storms coming at the state of Louisiana, and those storms are only strengthening. They're not weakening. They're becoming more frequent. And so we are literally at the front lines of climate change, at the effects of climate change here in the state of Louisiana. And I think, from our standpoint, for far too long, we have been reacting to the effects of climate change in the state of Louisiana, but we've done very little to address the causes of climate change.
There's a very ambitious plan for the state to cut emissions by 2025.
The governor has requested the federal government, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to begin evaluating renewables, in particular offshore wind off the coast of Louisiana. And so, yes, renewables will play a part in our long-term strategy, and it's up to this task force to really determine what's feasible for that 5-year range, for that short-term reduction in emissions, the midterm in 10 years out, and then the long-term 30 years out for the net zero by 2050.
Now, because of hurricanes, people might kind of joke, yeah, we should be really good at using wind. But the fact of the matter is there's a great deal of potential out there.
Oh, right. We have the industries that are in operation today. Louisiana companies helped put together the Rock Island offshore wind off the East Coast. So they've been involved from the very beginning in offshore wind in the United States. We have some of the best offshore servicing companies in the world that have typically been servicing offshore oil rigs, but the technology, the skill and expertise carries over very well to offshore wind.
People will say that it's going to cripple Louisiana because of the oil industry. Chip, what about that?
Well, I think it's just about striking the right balance. Our economy here in South Louisiana is very carbon intensive. And by no way are we saying that we need to completely get rid of or stop using fossil fuels. But I do think there is a way of striking the right balance, of developing renewable energy, developing the potential to use wind energy off of our shores, but at the same time, working with the oil and gas industry about how they go about doing their business. Either it's carbon capturing techniques where they're capturing this carbon emissions that they're putting into the atmosphere and storing it in areas across the coast, or just using cleaner technologies. There's so much technological advances that have been made in recent years. And I think really the people in Louisiana don't really recognize how much work the industry itself has done.
There are two strategies, adaptation and mitigation. And if you guys would discuss that and what that simply means.
Adaptation is, for example, the state's coastal master plan, the $50 billion, 50-year plan to restore and protect our coastal communities and ecosystems. It also includes the state's watershed initiative, which looks at reducing flood risk off of the coast inland from heavy downpours and riverine flooding. It's elevating our homes, whereas mitigation is really reducing emissions. And that's what Dr. Virginia Burkett at the first meeting of the Climate Task Force, she is the leading scientist, climate scientist at USGS, and she focused in on, while adaptation is important, you need that mitigation to avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
If you look at some of the projections that are associated with sea level rise, subsidence, the severity of storms, the frequency of storms, if we don't take action now, we stand to lose an additional 4,000 square miles of land.
Chip, would you discuss as chair the people involved in this? It's a wide range of people who have been called together to be on this task force.
We've got industry representatives, we've got academia, we've got nonprofits, we've got community representation, environmental groups, oil and gas representatives, all of whom have differing viewpoints. But I think that we need to get all of the viewpoints on the table and then come up with solutions and then determine what the trade-offs are on those solutions. I don't want to have, at the end of the day, all of these pie in the sky concepts that we can't implement. And therefore we have a report or a study that sits on a shelf. We want solutions that we can actually implement that's going to help sustain the economy, but also address the effects of climate change. What is the science telling us about climate change? What is the science telling us about the effects of climate change in our state? And those effects, they're downright scary. And so people here shouldn't just look at this as, well, that's a Democratic issue or that's a Republican issue. This is a Louisiana issue. And if we don't get serious about it, we're going to lose our state.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
As we all know, 2020 has delivered steady doses of the worst kind of news, but it seems Louisianans with hurricanes have had more than most. And now, for some in Louisiana, another blow, the closing of the Shell oil refinery after 53 years in Convent. It's on the river between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It was known for months that Shell was looking for a buyer, part of their move toward greener energy, the company said. But when Neshelle Nogess, who works for St. James Parish Schools in the financial business office, found out they were closing, it was a total shock.
I learned about the imminent shutdown of the refinery probably last Saturday when I read it in the newspaper, and probably last Thursday is when we learned how fast the facility would be closing.
The loss of Shell is a huge blow for the parish. It's the end of hundreds of jobs and could cost local public schools almost $14 million in the next year and a half, and who knows beyond that.
How are people reacting just in general in the parish?
It's a shock. It's a shock for everyone. Like I said, when I read it in the paper last Saturday, I really thought we had time, because what I read in the paper stated that they were putting the facility up for sale. And then not even 4 or 5 days later, we learned that it was shutting down.
For more than half a century, Shell delivered a huge tax base for the entire parish. Jim Mitchell is administrative director of schools. When he retires at the end of the year, Ashley Montz will take over for him.
This is a continuation of 2020 from the standpoint of the St. James Parish School Board and the other taxing bodies in this parish. This is the unthinkable. The Shell Convent refinery pays 27% of the property tax bill in St. James Parish. So needless to say, when you cut out over a quarter of your assessed and taxable value, there are going to be repercussions that roll down the hill. Our budget this year is right at $60 million. We are anticipating a loss of revenue for the new budget year that will begin July 1, 2021 of $10.1 million. Those are estimates based on what we've received from Neshelle with the sales and use tax revenue, as well as from the assessor Glenn Wagaspack, who sets the evaluations in the parish. The actual shutdown came as a shock to everybody. Obviously, first and foremost, those 700 family employees, contract workers, and their families who got the news that Thursday morning. But we got that news that Thursday morning shortly after the press conference, and we have been scrambling ever since to kind of put the picture together, first and foremost to identify what type of loss we're looking at as far as revenue. Secondly, to determine where we go from here, obviously.
Mitchell says adjustments won't have to be made until the beginning of January of 2022. There's a personal hurt also. Montz says Shell was such a good partner.
As far as like we talking all the revenue we get in tax-wise, but also they do a lot of stuff on the school levels, on the district level for different grants that people may apply for, you know, $5,000, $10,000 grants here and there, depending on what it's for. We have partnerships with them that we get pretty much annual grants that we get from them for certain things every year. It may be STEM camps, or it may be different things that we put on throughout the district. Like I said, on the individual school basis level, they apply for different things. And I mean, they have always been a great partner with the school system as far as that goes, and the community as well.
This is devastating in many, many different levels. Obviously, initially to the employees and contract labor workers who are all of a sudden out of a job. And now we're looking at the secondary devastation.
Shell opened in Convent in 1967. The company says it employs 657 people. No specific word on other Shell jobs being made available, though the company has said they would work on that. And everyone, that is our show for this week. Remember, you can watch anything LPB anytime, wherever you are, with our LPB app. You can catch LPB news and public affairs shows, as well as other Louisiana programs that you've come to enjoy over the years. And please like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For everyone at Louisiana Public Broadcasting, I'm André Moreau. Until next time, that's the state we're in.
Entergy is proud to support programming on LPB and greener practices that preserve Louisiana.
The goal of our environmental and sustainability initiatives really is to ensure that our kids and future generations can be left with a cleaner planet.
Additional support provided by the Fred B. and Ruth B. Ziegler Foundation and the Ziegler Art Museum located in Jennings City Hall. The museum focuses on emerging Louisiana artists and is an historical and cultural center for Southwest Louisiana. And the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting, with support from viewers like you.